life lesson about being a musician my entire life. Then going on, building bikes, starting off slow, ultimately going out and winning a championship, shows me that there's untapped potential inside all of us. And some of us will never know. Music is the most important thing in the world to me. And I listen to music differently than anyone else. I've been a music guy my whole life, and I don't think at any point in time until now, anyone would look back and say, there's a championship motorcycle racer guy right there. No, hell no.
I need to modify myself. I wish I had the luxury of
I got into music almost by happenstance. My mom took me shopping. Little 5-year-old kid took off running down the mall, and she went to look for me, and there I was sitting in the music store plunking out the theme to Brian's song, and I was trying to figure out the notes of the song. So she bought this baby grand piano, and she had this vision of me wearing a suit and playing the piano in our living room when she'd have cocktail parties. And in fact, that did actually happen. But while the neighborhood kids were out playing basketball, I was in practicing the piano and playing Chopin. And once I could play my own stuff, forget about it. I'm not going to learn Beethoven, not going to learn Chopin. I'm going to go off and do my own stuff. When you love something like that and it means so much to you, it's like, wow, it would absorb me, and it was my comfort. And when there was unrest in the house, which there was quite often, this is where I could go to. So it made me feel boundless. Around 9th grade, my mom decided that she was going to go back to school. She had been divorced now, and she moved the family up towards near Seattle. Around that time, I just started dabbling, playing with other bands, but you couldn't be in a band with a piano. Nobody was doing that unless you were Elton John. You know, you got a guy playing drums and guitar, and he can't even hear the piano. Once she moved us, my grades kind of plummeted. I wasn't fitting in very well, and she said, if you can get your grades up, I'll look into getting you a synthesizer. So one day I came home, and she had this ARP Odyssey synthesizer. I owe my mom everything for that. Then I could plug into a guitar amp and I could play just as loud as the guy playing guitar next to me. The new keyboards that were coming out were $5,000, and you get this big, beautiful Roland polyphonic synthesizer. I didn't have any money, but my friend's dad in this band I was playing in had this old clunky, cheesy organ, kind of a famous Italian brand called Farfisa, and it sounds like 96 tears, ding, 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 but it was electronic, and I could plug it through an amplifier. So I put it through a space echo and flangers and stuff, and I play this thing, and it sounded heavenly. And I would go out and I'd have this old thing making this incredible sound, and guys that did have the $5,000 synthesizers would come up and say, what the hell is that thing that you're playing? And I'd say, that's my Farfisa organ. I'm running it through this whole bank of effects and stuff to try and emulate what it is that you have. So here I was playing in Seattle, partying, 18 years old, started playing in bars. Couldn't drink, but I did. We had good times. We ended up playing like 4 or 5 nights a week. Everything shut down at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then the party would go till 4 or 5 in the morning, and just always raucous times. And I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the afternoon and go to sound check and do it again. I didn't have to go grocery shopping. I was recognized in the street. It was kind of cool to be a rock star, a big fish in a small pond at that time. It was 1984. I was dating a girl, and she went to her junior year of college in New York. We had a long-distance relationship. My band was probably at its strongest, but I decided I'd come out to New York and visit her. Flew out and said, oh my God, what am I doing with my life? This is where I have to be. And you want to talk about obsession. I obsessed about New York. I couldn't believe that you could drink a beer on the street. This just like lawlessness of New York City in the 80s was like, this is where I have to be. Off to New York I go. I moved to New York in the summer of 1986, 22 years old, had $500 in my pocket. I had never experienced heat like that. And I remember I moved my musical gear into the kitchen and we used to sit in there and jam because the air conditioner was in the kitchen. And if you moved away from the air draft, you'd sweat. I came to this dense, thick, humid, heat-soaked, insane asylum, and I loved it. Spent a lot of time with Joey Ramone. He was my bud, and we would stay out all night, but it was intense. Crime scenes or taxi drivers beating each other up, go out drinking, and you'd end up in some mafioso bar in Ozone Park. I had to get a job. I had no money, and it's an expensive city to live in. So I remember looking in the back of the Village Voice, and I saw an ad, and it said, driver wanted, must know musical equipment. I said, well, I got a driver's license, and I know musical equipment. So I ended up working for this company called SIR, where they deliver equipment to studios or to bands or whatever, rental type stuff. For better or worse, it changed what I was doing in New York. I ended up touring with a lot of these bands, doing a lot of the programming of the keyboards and stuff because I was so good at that. And then I started working for Saturday Night Live and doing programming for their show and all the keyboards and stuff. I played with Elvis Costello. I taught Sting about American baseball because the band would be rehearsing and I'd be sitting behind the desk with the Yankees on. And I played with Patti LaBelle for 2 years. Who would think that this kid would be playing on Soul Train with an R&B artist? Had you told me that 10 years before, I never would have believed you. I was so happy to be a part of this, but at the same time, it wasn't my calling. It was pulling at me from both sides. I loved the fact that I was working in music. But every night after the show, I get on the tour bus and we go to the next city, and I just sit there and say, oh, what am I doing? What am I doing? What am I doing? I was well respected and paid for the nuts and bolts of what I could do, but it wasn't a creative process. I wasn't making it myself. I was simply a side person. I went into Tower Records in Nashville, and I was using my credit card, and the woman behind the counter said, can I see your driver's license? She wanted some ID. So I pulled out my Seattle driver's license, and I handed it to her, and she looked at it, and she said, oh, you must know these guys. I listened, and I said, no, don't know who this is. So she pulled the CD down, and she handed it to me, and I looked at it, and I opened it up, and there were my friends in this band Pearl Jam. And at that moment, I felt like, oh, fuck, what have I done? I moved to New York and Seattle's blowing up. I mean, I bought the CD and then talked to my friends and yeah, they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame now. Good for them. When I decided to stop and do my own music, I wanted to sing. I was writing lyrics. I didn't want to be playing keyboards. So I picked up the guitar, and I'm a hack, and I'm still a hack at the guitar. But maybe because I was a hack, I voiced chords differently and so on and so forth. So I started playing guitar, and guitar is my instrument forever.
We're called Little Shining Man from New York City. Come have fun, all right? This is Honey.
We put this band together called Little Shining Man, and this is pre-internet, so there's not a lot on Little Shining Man, but man, we were prolific. Back then, we would work hell or high water. We were in the studio recording or writing or doing gigs, and I needed this routine to harness the obsession, the OCD that I had about everything. I found it's hard for others to keep up. I started to burn out a little bit, and I started to get that feeling like I needed to change, but I'm afraid to change, and took a long break. I'm friends with Philip Glass, this avant-garde composer, and he's been a friend for a long time. And I remember being at Philip's house and he said, what are you doing with your music, Kenny? And I said, nothing. And I feel bad, Philip. And we were outside, I was having a cigarette in his deck, and he's sitting there and he looked at me and he said, happens to me all the time. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, sure. Recalibrate. It'll come back. I knew I needed to do some more music. And I hooked up with Phil Schuster, my buddy still. And we formed this band Shelby, which was the biggest band that I had, indie rock band. Also the band that I worked the least in. Phil had this sort of arrogance, I thought at the time, but in fact it was just he had his boundaries. And he said, we're not going to play shitty shows. We're not going to go out and sell our soul for this. We're just going to do our thing. And we started formulating this record. We had no agenda. We had nothing going on. We had nothing but time to make this record. And I remember, again, obsessing and listening to kick drums for 2 days straight and saying, oh, it's not good, and mixing it. And then suddenly this record label had heard some of the EP and some of this stuff and wanted to sign us. Then we started doing some big shows, South by Southwest. We went and headlined a show down there and did some little tours with some good bands. And Shelby was a wonderful thing. It was hard for me because I felt like I had to put in every molecule of my soul into making something succeed. Shelby was much more like, hey, I'm going to go up to the studio. You want to come up? Okay, yeah, come up. Boom, this beautiful thing would be composed. And it was something that I still grapple with today, sort of letting go and letting things happen. And Phil is still my bud, and we're still waiting to do our third record together, but we also would butt heads sometimes. And so we decided to take a break. It was around that time that I had really started to get into the bike stuff. Also, I'd had a kid. I wasn't 18 years old anymore, and I was going through this sort of arc of how's music going to work for me. The business was changing. I had a straight job to sort of fund Shelby, and I had an assistant. She was this cool girl. She came in, and her first day she walked into my office, and she said, oh, I hear you're kind of the cool guy around here. You're in a band and this and this. And she saw the CD of my band sitting on my desk, Shelby, and she said, is this your band? And I said, yeah. And she said, huh, can I burn this? And I thought, you could burn it or you could buy it. But I realized that was it. The business had changed. In come the motorcycles. I had bought my first Norton Commando in 1995. It goes without saying when you buy an English bike that you're going to have to work on the bike. And I had no faculties to work on a motorcycle. I didn't have any tools. I didn't have any space, but I was going to buy this bike, and it was going to be the greatest thing on earth. Oh my God. Talk about obsessing. This was this machine. It was so different from synthesizers. It was this analog beast, pistons that moved up and down, and it smelled, and it made this beautiful sound. And I ran out and bought a cheapo helmet so I could ride around Manhattan with a smile on my face, and rode it around for about 2 hours, and it died. And I thought, shit. So I pushed it home, middle of summer. I had no mechanical skills whatsoever. So I had to go out to the hardware store and buy a wrench, which I did. This is the first tool I ever bought in my life. Now look at me. This is the disease right here. I was never successful in figuring out what was wrong with the bike. I know now what was wrong with the bike, but so I pushed it over to a bike shop, and a few $100s later, they fixed it, and I rode it around again a couple weeks later, and then it crapped out on me again. I was so dejected because this was going to cost $1,000 to fix, and having a cigarette on Hugh's stoop, and he's got my bike, and he comes out and he kind of puts his hand on my shoulder, and he's Scottish. He has this brogue, and he says, Kenny, the guys that own these bikes, man, they think about them when they eat. They think about them when they sleep. It's a commitment, man. It's for life. Maybe this isn't for you. And when he said that, I was like, no way, dude. There is no way you're going to say that to me. Now, I talk to Hugh about this quite often, and I say, do you remember when you did that? You lit a fire under my pants, and so I had to get my bike back and get it going, and I did. And rode the Commando around and took it all over, and circles widening and taking it out, for weekend trips here and there. And, they're fussy bikes. And then I was out with some friends upstate, and I went into a turn, and I did everything wrong. I thought, I'm coming in too hot, and I tried to grab the brake, and I grabbed the clutch, and my brain froze, and I went off, hit a tree stump, hit my arm, knocked my arm out of the socket, almost lost my arm, and bike went into the ditch and crashed. It was probably one of the lowest points of my life. Taking the train home from upstate while the bike was on my friend's garage in a heap. And I thought, what the hell am I doing? This is dangerous stuff. This is very serious stuff. Chilled out for a day or two and thought, if you're gonna do this, you're gonna do it 100%. You're gonna learn how to ride a motorcycle for real. Sell the bike or do it 110%. I had gone to see my dad. I didn't grow up together with my dad, and he had a motorcycle when I was a kid. You know, when he divorced my mom, he went through his midlife or whatever and bought himself a bike, and I would ride on the back of that bike all the time. But I said, so, yeah, I bought a motorcycle, and he said, oh, really? What'd you buy? And I said, oh, I bought a Norton Commando. What'd you buy a Norton for? And I said, I don't know. That name, that logo, it's always been ingrained in my psyche that I've always wanted to have this Norton. I finally got a job. I can afford it. I've been working on it. I've been rebuilding it. And he chuckled and he went downstairs and he came back up with a photo album of me as a little kid on his Norton. And I knew he had a bike, but I didn't know it was a Norton. And he said, yeah, don't you remember my Norton? And I said, wow. In one of the visits to my dad, there was a bike show and a motorcycle race going on in Park City, Utah. To have motorcycles racing in their front yards, they'd close off the streets. This was an incredible thing that only happened once. And I'd never seen a race before. And I went up into the pits and this was it. I felt like I had found where I needed to be. So I went back and started to build a race bike. It was a custom Norton. It was a featherbed frame, a type of frame that was used in the 60s with a Commando engine, a 70s era engine, and I built this race bike. My first race is this incredible race at Mid-Ohio, and I brought my shiny Norton out there, and my friends came out with me, and I remember I had my one French friend who didn't mince words, and he was smoking a cigarette after my first race, and he said, Kenny, you are so slow. You look so stupid out there. You have to stop doing this. That was all I needed to hear. The motorcycles, they're incredible. And for a few moments on that racetrack, it's everything in the world. But if I had to choose, I would hold on to music forever. That's the thing that's inside of me the most. It's the thing I go home to, and that's gonna be with me forever. It's a blessing and a curse. I can't listen to a song recreationally. I'm also listening to why the kick drum sounds the way it sounds, or why the guitar tones are the way they are. Putting something together in a line to get a sound out of the end is the same thing as setting the piston to wall clearance on an engine. And my lesson looking back, or it's not a lesson, but it's a realization that there's stuff inside everyone that's untapped. You might be an artist or you might be a writer, and these opportunities come by and they just sort of go by, and one day grab one and let it shine. It's the one thing I thought, geez, I have life figured out. I had life figured out 20 some odd years ago, and suddenly I race motorcycles and I say, shit, I don't have anything figured out. There's more. What else is inside there? I think everyone has this other bit in their brain that's underutilized. Bring it out.
How was your life? How was your job today? Some kind of peace of mind told you were the right, you were replacement time, guaranteed to shine. And you were so right.